Hi, I'm Andrea Cinque. Welcome to Eye on San Francisco. I'm here with John Barron today. John is the world-leading nutraceutical researcher, otherwise known as the Health Renaissance Man. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here again.
John, you're also an author. I'm sorry I didn't give you the right accolades as well. And I know you're the author of Lessons from the Miracle Doctors. Okay? And here it is. And John, why don't you tell us a little bit about this book?
Basically, it was the result of about 8 or 9 years that I spent. When I started doing this 40 years ago, you didn't have all the newsletters, you didn't have the resources. You had to go find the people who were practicing in secret, and it was by double-blind referral because a lot of them would get arrested for practicing medicine. So I learned from them and found that they had certain things in common and had never been written down. And I took what they were doing and added some of my understanding of it to create, if you will, a manual for optimizing health and getting rid of catastrophic illness. And that's what the book is. It's a step-by-step manual for optimizing health.
Well, now that's interesting, that topic, optimizing health, because we're talking about healthcare legislation, and we're talking about how we can empower ourselves to stay healthy and to make the right choices so that we don't have to worry about the healthcare system failing us or being too costly. So let's focus on our health freedoms, the topic.
Okay. One of the things you need to understand is that there are certain aspects you've always been limited in your ability to gain access to health. I think we mentioned in the last show that in half the states in the United States, it's illegal even for medical doctors to prescribe anything other than chemo, radiation, or surgery for cancer. Well, there are other limitations on your ability to practice health. And there are continual assaults. For example, the organic is continually under assault. About 10 years ago, there were attempts by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to change the definition of organic so that growers of livestock basically were required to use organic feed unless it wasn't readily available. Then they could use any feed, but the animal would still be sold as organic. There were chicken farmers who wanted to do the same thing. They looked for the ability to use reprocessed municipal sewage waste, high in heavy metals. But basically it was sewage, therefore they called it organic. And again, these things have been beaten down. When they wanted to change the definition of organic, for example, it was the largest outpouring of email, phone calls, and letters in the history of Congress. I mean, people objecting. So the large things are basically fine. There are people watching it. It helps if you were aware, and if you see an assault on your ability to buy a supplement that you want, buy herbs that you want, that you take action. And by the way, email is the least effective option. Calling or writing can get a response. You can actually make a difference. And a lot of these things are smoke screens. I describe it. Did you ever see the movie Catch Me If You Can, the Steven Spielberg?
Yes.
Okay. There's a scene in there where he talks about his father teaching him about the Yankees. The Yankees won all the pennants not because they were better, but because they got everyone looking at their pinstripes. It was, in other words, they distracted people who came into Yankee Stadium. Well, a lot of what's going on is a distraction. They're basically having you focus on big legislation here, and they're picking your pocket, your freedoms here. And they're doing it without legislation. And that's actually worth focusing on because it's so key. You're losing constantly rights to access things, and it's never in legislation. You never see it happening, and it's being done under the table. I'll give you a couple examples. And there are many of them. But two big ones stand out is the way ephedra basically was pulled from the market.
And I used to take ephedra.
And kava kava. Let's talk. Ephedra is a great story. Let's talk about it.
Ephedra is great because it gave you such a lift.
It gave you a lift, and it did remove, it helped people lose weight. Now, one of the objections said it didn't do that. The millions of people who used it, no, it did. I'm not a great fan of ephedra for a different reason, because it drains the adrenals, and if you don't make lifestyle changes, and you keep using it to keep the weight off, eventually you drain the adrenals, the weight comes back on, and now you've got exhausted adrenals, and it won't work anymore. That aside, the argument against it, or the case against it, that it caused strokes, is totally bogus. Let's talk about how they came up with that case against it.
Because that's why I stopped taking it, is because they said it caused strokes, and I have strokes in my family.
Well, there's actually another reason you stop taking it. It's very difficult to find now. And we'll talk about why that happened without ever any legislation happening. Your pocket was picked. What they did is they conducted a study, and this is marvelous, because if you phrase things correctly, you can get any result you want. They looked for people who had had strokes and also used ephedra. It took them 2 years to come up with something like 70 people who fit that criteria. They said, look, we have 70 people who died unnecessarily because they used ephedra, had strokes, they didn't necessarily die, but had strokes and used ephedra. This is horrible. We need to watch this carefully. They didn't actually eliminate it. But let me give you another study. Let's do a study of everybody who drinks water and has had a stroke. Now, we're going to come up with a much higher number, and it's 100% correlation. They had water, they had a stroke. Obviously, water is causing the stroke. We need to put a watch on water. In other words, it's a meaningless study.
Of course.
A far more meaningful study is to compare the two groups. What is the incidence of stroke, the rate of strokes in a group of the population that used ephedra and a group of the population that did not? And that study was done, and the result was there's no difference. That basically the rate of strokes, the incidence of strokes was the same. Now, the other thing in ephedra, the one that put it over the top, was the baseball player. I'm trying to remember, it's several years. I think his name was Steve Beckler. Baseball player, professional baseball player. In spring training, in the middle of training, he collapsed to the ground, dropped dead. Okay.
Right. And they attribute that to ephedra.
To ephedra. Let's talk about what happened there, because then off of that, the FDA basically felt empowered to take a step that ultimately eliminated your ability to buy it. What happened is Steve, interestingly enough, basically had a history of basically collapsing during training. He'd done it in high school, done it several times since. His family had a history. His brother had died by collapsing suddenly on the field. His family had a history of that. He was significantly overweight, out of shape. He had not eaten solid food for 2 to 3 days before the training. The day he was training was very hot, very humid. He was wearing 3 layers of sweat clothes to lose extra weight. When he collapsed to the ground and they measured his core body temperature, was 106.
Oh.
Now, why, with all of these circumstances you would think might contribute to somebody collapsing and dying, did the team doctor focus on the ephedra? Well, think about it. If someone dies suddenly while training for no apparent reason, what is his family going to want to do?
An autopsy.
They're going to want to look for the cause and sue. So what the team does is, well, if we say basically it's because we allowed him to practice in these conditions, these unsafe, we're liable. But if it's ephedra, we're not liable. So effectively, they pinned it on ephedra.
Oh, interesting.
Even though there are so many other, not saying that ephedra may or may not have been a factor, but the fact is all of these other things negate the conclusion. You can't make that conclusion. But based on basically the
So there was
70...
a panic attack that occurred after that with the nation.
With the nation. And what happened is the insurance company started telling manufacturers, we will no longer insure you if you distribute or manufacture an ephedra product. Why? And I've talked to the insurance companies. They tell you they don't care whether it's true or not. In fact, they didn't believe it, but the problem is there is a perception. That means if someone has used ephedra and they have a stroke, they will automatically go to court. The insurance company already has to pay to defend, and if perchance they should lose, it's many millions of dollars. So what they say is, we won't insure you anymore. That means you're at risk. So the only people left who will carry it are very small manufacturers who don't care about insurance or pulling the money out very quickly, have very little to be sued for. What happens, that contracts the base, whereas millions of people were using ephedra and had a high support group. When it was no longer available, fewer and fewer people were attached. The FDA ultimately said, we're banning sales, and that was actually overturned in a court ruling. So you have circumstances where no legislation, no decision, nothing, no option you have, and your ability to buy ephedra, for good or bad, was removed from you. Kava Kava is another example, one of my favorite ones, because I really love Kava Kava.
Me too. I used it to sleep.
Very hard to find good Kava Kava now. Why? Because about 4 or 5 years ago, there were 2 things that triggered it. One, a study out of Germany and Sweden that said 30 people who had used Kava Kava had developed severe liver complications. I think 4 of them required transplants, 1 died. What they never mentioned in the study is of the 30, 21 were on heavy hepatotoxic drugs, drugs that caused liver damage, or were severe alcoholics, and the other 9 used multiple drugs that probably had hepatotoxic consequences, totally invalidating the conclusion that Kava Kava was responsible. The other one was the FDA has what they call a MedWatch site, and a report was on it from a mid-1996 rave party in Los Angeles, where, according to the LA police, a bunch of kids used something that contained Kava Kava and showed liver toxicity. That was posted on the website. 2 weeks after they made the announcement, they re-announced and said, no, on further investigation, no Kava Kava at all. They were using an industrial chemical. That information still stayed on the Medline site based on the German study the FDA announced, based on these 2 studies, even knowing one of them is totally false, said we are putting a watch on Kava Kava. Not banning it, but a watch. Again, the insurance companies start basically saying we won't insure it. It's very difficult to insure. Suddenly it's less available. What's the truth in kava kava? It's one of the most studied herbs in history. There are hundreds of studies with thousands of people that prove it is effective and does not cause liver damage, only in the most extreme cases where people are using extreme amounts. They're actually like kava addicts for long periods of time. There is an indication it may.
Well, anything in abuse is
exactly.
going to have adverse reactions to.
Favorite example is if you have too much water in one day, you'll explode and die. That's absolutely true. Too much of anything will give a problem. But kava kava is basically safe. But again, Chaparral that said it caused liver damage, later refuted, still black-marked. And these things live as urban myths on the net. You search Chaparral, you'll see liver damage, even though it's refuted. DMSO, another one. They're legion, and what they do is basically through misinformation, through promoting incorrect stories, they're causing limitations on your ability to attain supplements or treatments that can be of benefit to you. That's a real problem.
And it's sad because some of those alternative drugs, I say alternative drugs, ephedra, alternative, what's the term for them?
Just call them natural alternatives.
Natural alternatives. Thank you very much. They help people.
They do.
They help me. And I don't want to say, what drug I'm on now to help me with my sleep, but kava kava was a great drug for me, and it's an alternative. And it worked. But I got scared when I saw all the media hype on
That's
that.
right.
It's frightened me because I know that it's not regulated, and I know, well, maybe they know something I don't know, and I should heed the warning.
Absolutely. It uses fear, and it's your fear that then causes other people to start backing
So
off.
why aren't you on all the major networks talking about this?
Well, there's an issue here that the networks look to the same people, basically the medical authorities who support this case to support, basically, those are the people they call on as authorities.
Right.
It's sort of like an inbreeding.
Right.
The story does get out, the information does get out, actually largely thanks to the internet. The newsletter that we put out on
Which is johnbarron.org.
.org.
JONBARRON.org.
Viewers can go and subscribe to the free newsletter we put out. It goes to virtually every country around the world. It keeps you informed. It'll empower you. And that's
John Barron, JONBARRON.org.
correct.
Hold that thought. We're going to go to a commercial break, and we'll be right back.
Tremendous.
I'm Andrea Cinque. We'll be back on Eye on San Francisco.